It was a sunny morning in Sao Paulo, the kind of day when the city's hustle and bustle didn't feel overwhelming, but rather alive with potential. Clara, a young tourist from a quiet town, found herself lost in the chaos. But there was something about the city that intrigued her. The people, the noise, the colors. Everything felt like it was unfolding right in front of her. Yet, as much as she marveled at the energy around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She hadn't yet connected with anyone, and she longed to feel part of this vibrant world. Wandering through one of the city's busiest streets, Clara's attention was drawn to a park bench at the corner of the plaza. An elderly man sat there, alone, scribbling into a worn-out notebook. His clothes were faded, his hair unruly, and his posture bent with age. Despite the world moving rapidly around him, he seemed untouched by it all, lost in the words he was writing. Clara couldn't help but notice how out of place he seemed. Her instincts kicked in. Who was he? Why was he so quiet amidst all the noise? It wasn't just curiosity. Something deeper pulled her toward him. She walked closer, trying to peer into the notebook without being too obvious. But before she could catch a glimpse of his words, he looked up and met her gaze. His eyes were sharp, intense, but also filled with a deep sadness. Clara froze for a second. His gaze seemed to pierce right through her, as if he could see the loneliness she was trying to hide. There was a long pause, the kind of silence that felt like it stretched forever. He didn't speak, but his presence felt oddly magnetic, like the world was waiting for something. Clara took a breath, pushing past the hesitation that gripped her. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the city noise. The man didn't answer immediately. His eyes lingered on her, as if measuring her. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded and returned his focus to the notebook. Curiosity gnawed at Clara. This man, a stranger in this vast city, had caught her attention in a way no one else had. She wanted to know more. She couldn't just walk away. She glanced around. The city was alive, but this moment, this chance encounter, felt like an opportunity she couldn't miss. Taking a deep breath, she walked up to him, standing a few feet away. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, hoping it didn't sound too intrusive. "I notice you here every day. Maybe you're thirsty?" The old man didn't immediately react, his fingers still poised above his notebook. For a brief moment, Clara wondered if she had crossed a line. She thought about backing away, but then he looked up at her again, this time his expression softening ever so slightly. "Yes," he said, his voice rough, like it hadn't been used much in a while. "Black coffee, no sugar." Clara smiled, the small gesture lifting some of the weight in the air. "I'll be back in a few minutes," she said, her voice steady but her heart racing. She turned and walked to the nearby cafe, her mind spinning with questions. Who was this man? Why did he seem so alone and yet so content in his silence? As Clara made her way back with the coffee, she found herself increasingly drawn to the stranger. There was something about him, something familiar yet utterly unknown. Maybe it was his eyes, so full of stories left untold, or the way he seemed to carry an entire world in the words he wrote. Either way, Clara knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a simple encounter. Something about this man, about their meeting, felt like the beginning of a story she was meant to be part of. When she returned with the coffee, he accepted it without a word, still focused on his notebook. But this time, there was a small shift in the air between them, an unspoken understanding, as if the simple act of sharing coffee had bridged the gap between two strangers from different worlds. Clara took a seat on the edge of the bench, her mind still racing, but for the first time since arriving in Sao Paulo, she didn't feel so alone. The man, João, did not speak again, but for reasons Clara couldn't explain, she didn't feel the need to fill the silence. As they sat there, side by side, she realized that sometimes the best conversations happen without a single word being exchanged. As the minutes passed, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a beginning to something much bigger than both of them. And as she sat there, watching João carefully write his next poem, a strange sense of excitement bubbled up inside her. What was it about this moment that felt so significant? She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew she'd be back tomorrow. The next morning, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she had left something unsaid, something unspoken between her and Joao. She tried to push the thought away as she got ready for the day, but it lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just the coffee or the brief conversation that had left an impact. There was something about Joao, his presence, his quiet resilience, that called to her. By the time Clara reached the park bench again, the city was just waking up, the early light spilling across the streets in a soft golden hue. She spotted Joao sitting exactly where she had left him the day before, still hunched over his notebook, writing feverishly. He didn't even look up this time as she approached, and Clara felt a strange sense of peace wash over her as she sat beside him without a word. She didn't bring coffee this time. Instead, she pulled out a small sandwich from her bag and placed it on the bench between them. The gesture was simple, yet she felt it spoke volumes. Joao's hands paused for a moment as he looked at the sandwich, his weathered fingers trembling slightly. Clara noticed a subtle change in his demeanor, a quiet recognition that she was there again, that she was here to listen, not to intrude. "I thought you might be hungry," Clara said, her voice soft, but filled with warmth. "It's nothing fancy, but, I can bring more if you'd like." Joao finally raised his eyes from a notebook, his gaze meeting hers again. There was something in his eyes now, something different. It wasn't just a sharpness from before, but a flicker of curiosity, of gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice still rough, but with a hint of something more. Clara watched as Joao slowly reached for the sandwich, his fingers brushing against hers for a brief moment. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They didn't speak for a while after that. Clara simply sat next to him, quietly observing. She watched the world pass by, the people hurrying to work, the cars honking, the street vendors calling out their goods. But in that moment, everything felt still. The noise seemed to fade into the background, and the only thing that mattered was the shared silence between her and Joao. Minutes passed, and Joao finished the sandwich in silence. Then, after a long pause, he turned toward her again, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever wonder," Joao said, his voice barely above a whisper, "if the world is just too much for us to carry?" Clara was taken aback by the question. It felt like a loaded statement, something he had carried with him for years, and now he was sharing it with her. She nodded slowly, unsure what to say. I think I do," she replied, her voice tentative. "It's hard sometimes, isn't it? You think you can handle everything, but then it gets too heavy." Joao looked at her for a long time, his eyes studying her as if searching for something within her. "You seem like someone who carries a lot on their shoulders," he said quietly. "I can tell, but you still came back. Why?" Clara felt her heart beat faster. She wasn't used to being seen like this, truly seen. It was almost as if Joao could look past her facade, past her carefully constructed life, and see the raw emotion she kept hidden. "I don't know," Clara admitted, her voice barely audible. "Maybe because I feel like there's something here with you, something I need to understand." Joao's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Poetry has a way of doing that," he said, his voice filled with a strange mix of sadness and wisdom. "It reveals things about us we don't always want to see." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. Poetry. It was something she hadn't thought much about in years. But in Joao's words, there was a depth that tugged at her heart. The idea that poetry could reveal parts of ourselves we often try to ignore or forget was both comforting and terrifying at once. "Will you read me some of your poems?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. It was a bold request, but it felt natural in that moment. Something inside her urged her to ask, to dive deeper into this connection, to learn more about this mysterious man who seemed to carry the weight of the world in his words. Joao hesitated. For a moment, Clara wondered if she had pushed too far, if he would shut her out completely. But then he opened the worn notebook and, with a slow and deliberate motion, began to read aloud. His voice was low and rough, yet it carried an undeniable power, each word dripping with the weight of experience. His poetry wasn't polished or refined. It was raw, messy, and filled with emotions that hit Clara in the gut. It was a poetry born of struggle, of a life lived on the margins, but it was beautiful in a way that Clara couldn't fully comprehend at first. "This one's about the city," Joao said, his eyes not meeting hers as he read, but rather fixed on the paper in front of him. It's about the noise that never stops, the people who never stop moving, but who are still so alone. Clara listened, mesmerized by the cadence of his words, by the honesty in them. Joel's poetry wasn't just about the city. It was about life, about the quiet moments in the chaos, the moments that people overlook. And as she listened, Clara realized that in Joel's words, there was a reflection of her own loneliness, her own desire to belong, to be seen. When he finished reading, Clara didn't know what to say. She was speechless. The poetry had stirred something inside her, something she hadn't known existed. "It's beautiful," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Joel met her gaze for the first time since he'd begun reading, his eyes searching hers. "I never thought anyone would say that," he replied, his voice soft but filled with disbelief. Clara smiled. "I'm not the only one who thinks so," she said quietly. "People should hear this. They should hear your story. Your words have power, Joel." For a moment, Joel said nothing. He simply closed a notebook, a faraway look in his eyes. "Maybe you're right," he said, almost to himself. It was then that Clara realized this wasn't just about poetry. This was about something far bigger. Joel had a story to tell, and Clara was going to help him tell it. And as she sat beside him in that crowded, noisy city, Clara knew one thing for certain. Their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could ever have imagined. The days that followed were a whirlwind of discovery and unspoken understanding. Clara found herself returning to the park bench every morning, and Joel was there, as if he had never left. Their routine was simple. Clara would bring coffee and a small meal. Joel would read his poetry, and the silence between them felt comfortable, almost necessary. But something had shifted. Clara no longer just wanted to listen. She felt the urge to share Joel's words with the world, to bring his poetry into the light. She had seen enough of the world's harshness and hustle of Sao Paulo, but Joel's poetry, his raw, unfiltered view of life, spoke to her in a way she couldn't ignore. She knew it wasn't just about art. It was about a message, a story that needed to be heard. On the fourth day of their routine, Clara took a leap. She asked Joel for his permission to share his poems on social media. She knew it was a bold request, but the conviction in her voice surprised even her. She wanted people to see Joel, not just as a man sitting on the bench, but as a voice that could echo far beyond the city's limits. "Would you let me share them?" Clara asked, her gaze steady as she waited for his response. Joel looked at her, his expression unreadable. He was silent for a long time, the weight of the question hanging in the air between them. Clara wasn't sure if he was going to refuse, if the idea of exposure, of others reading his deeply personal work, was too much for him. Finally, he nodded. "I've never let anyone read them outside these pages," he said slowly. "But I trust you, Clara." Her heart skipped a beat. This was the moment when everything changed. That evening, Clara created a social media account dedicated to sharing Joel's poetry. She posted a simple photograph of Joel sitting on the bench, his notebook open, with a short excerpt from his latest poem. The response was immediate, overwhelming. People from all over Sao Paulo began to share the post, leaving comments about how deeply Joel's words resonated with them. Some were moved by the vulnerability in his writing, others by the truth he spoke about life in the city. The following morning, when Clara arrived at the park, Joel was already there, scribbling in his notebook as usual. But today, there was a noticeable difference in his demeanor. His shoulders seemed a little straighter, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope, perhaps, or maybe the faintest glimmer of excitement. "Clara," Joel said, his voice almost tentative as he approached her. I don't understand. How did so many people find my words?" Clara smiled, holding up her phone. "I posted one of your poems last night, and people loved it. It's spreading, Joel. Your words are reaching people, and they're connecting." Joel took the phone from her hand, his eyes scanning the screen. The words were filled with genuine emotion as he read the comments. People from different backgrounds, all connecting with the truth in his poetry. One comment caught his eye. "This is what we need. Truth in art, truth in life." "Clara, this is..." Joel's voice cracked, and for the first time, Clara saw a tear in his eye. "This is more than I ever dreamed of. I never thought anyone would listen. People are listening. Joao, your voice matters, Clara said softly, her hand resting on his. And so, with that small spark, the ripple effect began. Clara continued to share Joao's poems one by one, each post garnering more attention, more followers. Soon, local journalists reached out to her, asking to interview Joao, to learn more about the mysterious poet who had captured the city's heart. With each interview, more people came to know Joao's story, and with it, the power of his words. But not everyone was happy about Joao's newfound attention. As his poems gained more followers, there were those who saw Joao's success as a threat, a man who had been invisible for so long, now suddenly in the spotlight. Clara noticed a subtle change in the city's energy. There were whispers at the park, in the streets, and even at the small cafe where they often went to grab lunch. Some people spoke in admiration, others in envy. One evening, Clara met Joao at the park bench with an unsettling sense of unease. The air was thick with tension, and the usual hum of the city felt strangely muted. As she approached him, she noticed a few men standing in the distance, watching them. They were dressed in sharp suits, the kind of people who didn't belong to the rhythm of the streets, and their eyes were fixed on Joao. "Who are they?" Clara asked, a chill running down her spine. Joao's face darkened as he noticed the men too. He didn't answer at first, his gaze moving between the strangers and Clara. "I don't know," he said after a long pause, "but I don't like the way they're looking at me." Clara's instincts kicked in. "We need to be careful, Joao," she said, her voice low. "There's something about them." Before Joao could respond, one of the men stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. "You're Joao the poet, right?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. Joao looked up, his expression guarded. "Yes, I'm Joao. Can I help you?" The man smiled coldly, his eyes scanning Joao, before shifting to Clara. "I'm Ricardo. We've been following your little social media account. It's been making quite a stir." Clara felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "What's this about?" she demanded, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. Ricardo's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's simple. We have connections. We think your poetry has potential. Potential to make more than just words on a page." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And we think you'd be better off working with the right people. People who can give you the exposure you deserve." Clara could feel the tension building between them, a sense of danger creeping in. She stepped closer to Joao, instinctively shielding him. "We're not interested," she said firmly. Ricardo's smile faltered for a moment before he leaned in closer. "I think you will be. You see, poetry isn't just about words. It's about power. And power, my friend, can change everything." With that, he turned on his heel, the other men following him, leaving Clara and Joao standing in the quiet aftermath. Joao's hands were trembling as he looked at Clara. "What did he mean by that?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Clara took a deep breath, her mind racing. "I don't know, Joao, but I don't like it." It was the first sign that Joao's rise to fame might come at a cost. The world of poetry, of words that once seemed so pure, was now drawing attention from darker forces. Clara knew that they were standing on the edge of something far bigger than they had ever anticipated, and as she watched the men disappear into the distance, she felt the weight of their journey ahead. The ripple effect of Joao's poetry had begun, but so had the storm that would come with it. The weeks following the encounter with Ricardo and his associates felt like a roller coaster of highs and lows. Joao's poetry continued to soar in popularity, and Clara's dedication to his success never wavered. Literary events, interviews, and even local radio stations were now buzzing with Joao's name. His words had captured the hearts of many, and Joao had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of creative expression in a city that often seemed too busy to notice the quieter souls. But in the midst of this rising fame, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had taken root ever since that day in the park. Ricardo's words, "Power can change everything," echoed in her mind. Who were these people? What were they really after? And why did Joao's poetry seem to have attracted such attention, not only from the public, but from those with questionable motives? One evening, Clara sat at her apartment, scrolling through her phone as she sifted through the comments and messages pouring in about Joao's work. Most were supportive, filled with admiration for his words. But then she came across a message that caught her eye. It was from a username she didn't recognize, just a string of random numbers and letters. The message was simple: be careful, they're watching. Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The message felt ominous, as if it were a warning, too vague to trust but too specific to ignore. She quickly checked her surroundings, as if the sender's words had some kind of tangible weight. Something was off, and Clara knew she had to dig deeper. The next morning, she arrived at the park as usual, coffee in hand, hoping that Joao's presence would ground her. But today, he wasn't sitting on the bench as expected. She glanced around, feeling a sense of panic building in her chest. Had something happened to him? She called his phone twice, but there was no answer. Just as she was about to leave, her eyes caught sight of him, sitting by the fountain at the edge of the park, looking lost in thought. Clara approached him cautiously, her heart racing. "Joao," she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Are you okay?" He looked up slowly, his eyes filled with weariness she hadn't seen before. "I'm fine," he muttered, but there was something unsettling in his tone. "Just thinking." Clara sat beside him, still unsure. "What's going on? You're not answering your phone." "I was worried." Joao took a deep breath before speaking. "There's something I need to tell you, Clara." His hands trembled as he spoke, and Clara noticed how pale he looked, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. "What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm, sensing that whatever it was important. Joao paused for a long time, his eyes searching the ground as though he were looking for the right words. "You remember Ricardo and his friends?" Clara nodded, her stomach twisting in response to the name. "They're not just interested in my poetry, Clara. They have other plans." Joel's voice dropped to a whisper, as if afraid someone might be listening. "I've been in touch with them, not by choice. They've been offering me offers I can't refuse. They want to use my poetry, my words, for something bigger, something dangerous." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What do they want?" Joel's gaze met hers, and there was a flicker of something. Fear, confusion, perhaps even regret. "I don't know all the details, but I've been doing some research, and there are things about them, about this group, that I didn't want to believe at first. They're connected to something far more sinister than poetry. There's a network, Clara, a network that uses art to manipulate people, to control minds. And they've set their sights on me." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean, control people?" she whispered, the weight of his words sinking in. "They take the art, the poetry, and use it as a tool. A weapon." Joel's voice shook. "They believe that words, when shaped the right way, can influence entire communities, maybe even entire nations. They have the power to sway minds, to create chaos, to rally people behind their cause. And they want to use my poetry to do that." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "And you're going along with it?" she asked, her eyes searching his, trying to understand. Joel shook his head quickly, the fear in his eyes now more pronounced. "No, I've been trying to find a way out. But it's not that simple, Clara. They have connections, money, power. They've already invested so much in me, and if I back out now, they won't let me go that easily." Clara's mind raced. "Then we have to stop them. We have to expose them." Joel's gaze hardened, a mixture of determination and fear. "I'm not sure how much time we have left. I think they're already planning something. But I need your help, Clara. We need to find out everything we can about them before it's too late." At that moment, Clara realized just how deep they were in. This was no longer just about poetry or a simple act of kindness. The stakes had grown higher. Joel's words had become a beacon, a tool for something far darker than they ever imagined. "Okay," Clara said, her voice steady now despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "We'll find a way. Together." As Clara and Joel sat in silence, a heavy weight pressed on their shoulders. The world they thought they knew, the world of poetry, beauty, and hope, was suddenly twisted by a dark undercurrent of power and control. What had started as an innocent friendship, a simple sharing of words, had now evolved into something dangerous, something far bigger than either of them had anticipated. But Clara wasn't about to back down. If Joao's poetry had the power to inspire, then it could also be the key to taking down the forces that sought to manipulate it for their own ends. They just needed to uncover the truth before it was too late. The days following Joao's revelation were a blur of activity. Clara's mind spun as she absorbed the full weight of Joao's words. The idea that his poetry, once a simple expression of his soul, had now become a pawn in a larger, more sinister game, gnawed at her. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Ricardo's cold smile haunted her. The realization that they were now entangled in something much larger than either of them had ever expected was overwhelming. Joao, despite the fear that lingered behind his eyes, seemed more determined than ever. His desire to protect his poetry and the people he cared about burned stronger than the dread he'd been carrying. Clara could see it in his eyes. He wasn't going to let them win. The two of them decided to dig deeper into the mysterious group Joao had become entangled with. They began to meet late at night, poring over old news articles, cryptic online forums, and hidden documents. Every lead they followed only revealed more chilling information. The group Joao had unknowingly aligned with, now known as the Collective, had been operating under the radar for years. They weren't just after Joao's poetry. They were after control of minds, of people, of society itself. But what shook Clara to the core wasn't just their intentions. It was a realization that the Collective had infiltrated some of the most influential circles in the city, even extending their reach to political figures, high-powered businessmen, and cultural elites. The network stretched far and wide, and Joao's words, his art, were a small but critical piece of their puzzle. It was clear now. The poetry was the bait, the hook, and the weapon. As Clara and Joao continued to dig deeper, they became more paranoid, more cautious. Every email, every message, every phone call felt like it could be a trap. Joao refused to let Clara attend any more literary events for fear of her being targeted, and Clara found herself constantly scanning the crowd, wondering who in the sea of faces might be working for Collective. But it wasn't just the physical world they had to worry about. They quickly discovered that the Collective had eyes everywhere, on social media, in online forums, in every corner of the digital world. Clara's phone was hacked. Joao's social media accounts were flooded with strange comments and threats. The tension between them reached a breaking point when Clara received an anonymous phone call, the voice on the other end distorted, but unmistakable in its threat. "If you care about Joao's poetry, you'll stop looking into us, or we'll make sure you never see him again." The line went dead. Clara dropped her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always feared something like this would happen. The threat was too clear to ignore. That night, she met Joao at their usual spot in the park, her heart heavy with the weight of the call. The air was thick with unease as they sat in silence, the moon casting long shadows over the empty benches. "I got a call," Clara whispered, the words leaving her mouth like a heavy burden. "They know what we're doing. They said if we keep digging, we won't see you again." Joao's face paled, and his hands trembled. "We're running out of time, Clara." He was right. The more they investigated, the tighter the web became. They could feel the Collective closing in on them, pulling the strings from the shadows. Their every move was being watched, and soon they would be forced into a corner with nowhere to run. But Clara wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not after everything they'd done. Everything Joao had fought for. "We need help," Clara said, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. "We can't do this alone." Joao looked at her, his eyes filled with both fear and hope. "But who can we trust? Who outside of our circle can we rely on?" Clara thought for a moment, the pieces clicking into place. "Ricardo. He's the key." Joao's gaze shot up, disbelief written all over his face. "What? Ricardo? Are you insane?" "No." Clara's tone was resolute. "He's a part of the Collective. Yes. But I don't think he's fully committed to whatever they're doing. There's something in his eyes, a hesitation, a conflict. He's been giving us warnings, whether he realizes it or not. If anyone can help us, it's him." Joao hesitated, but Clara could see the flicker of understanding in his eyes. He had nothing left to lose. They had nothing left to lose. "We have to meet with him," Clara said, more determined than ever. "We need to understand why he's been watching us, why he's been giving us those warnings. If he's our only chance, then we have to take it." The plan was set. The next day, Clara reached out to Ricardo, arranging a meeting in a secluded part of the city, a place where they could talk without fear of being overheard. As the day of the meeting approached, Clara's nerves were on edge. Every minute felt like an eternity. Would Ricardo betray them? Would they finally get the answers they needed? Or would they be walking straight into a trap? When the day finally arrived, Clara and Joao made their way to the location, a dilapidated warehouse at the edge of the city. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, and the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly. As they stepped inside, Clara's heart raced. The silence was deafening. And then, from the darkness, a voice cut through the stillness. "You came. I wasn't sure you would." Clara's eyes locked on Ricardo, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You know why we're here," Joao said, his voice a mix of anger and caution. "We need answers." Ricardo nodded slowly, his face shadowed by the dim light. "I know, and I can give you answers. But you're not going to like them." The room seemed to close in on them as Ricardo began to speak, the truth about the collective unraveling in front of their eyes. The air in the warehouse felt suffocating, thick with the weight of the unspoken truths that hung between them. Ricardo, standing in the dim light, had just uttered words that sent a chill through Clara and Joao. The truth about the collective was more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a group of shadowy figures manipulating art or poetry for profit. No, it was a clandestine force working its way through the core of society, controlling ideas, steering public sentiment, and shaping the future of the world without anyone realizing it. Everything you've written, Joao, every word, every phrase you've crafted, it's part of a much bigger design. Your poetry was never meant to be just art, Ricardo explained, his voice low and tinged with regret. It was meant to be a tool, a way to influence minds, to steer them in a direction the collective wanted. Clara's stomach churned. She turned to Joao, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. "No," he whispered, almost to himself. "I never meant for any of this to happen. It was just poetry." Ricardo stepped closer, his gaze softening. "It's more than just words, Joao. It always has been. The collective's reach goes far beyond what you ever thought possible. The people they control, those whose lives your poetry has touched, they're part of a system that uses your art to manipulate, to bring about a future they planned." Clara's mind raced. Every post, every poem they had shared, every person who had read Joao's words. Had it all been for nothing? Were they just cogs in a machine designed to control the narrative? But there was something else in Ricardo's eyes. Something that wasn't entirely aligned with the collective's ruthless agenda. He wasn't the man Clara had first met. Someone who had been watching from the shadows, pulling strings. No, there was a flicker of doubt in him now, a recognition that maybe he had been wrong all along. "Then why are you helping us, Ricardo?" Joao asked, his voice raw with confusion and pain. Ricardo's lips tightened. "Because it's not too late. I can't undo what's been done, but there's still a chance to stop them. We have to take down the people at the top. If we do, everything your poetry, the power holds, can be returned to the people. It can be theirs, not a tool for manipulation." Clara felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. Was it really possible to break free from the web they had become trapped in? Was it possible to reclaim their agency? "This is our chance," Clara said, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "We've come this far. We can't stop now." Joao's eyes shone with a renewed fire, the despair that had once clouded his gaze lifting like a dark cloud parting for sun. He looked at Clara and then at Ricardo. "What do we do next?" Ricardo motioned for them to follow him. "I have a way to get to them. We'll expose everything. The world needs to know the truth." The three of them moved through the dark alleyways of the city, careful to avoid the prying eyes that had once followed them. Each step felt like it could be their last, but Clara felt more certain than ever that they were doing the right thing. They reached an underground meeting place, a space hidden deep within the heart of the city. It was there in that dimly lit room that they met the final members of Collective. These were the minds behind it all, the ones who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, orchestrating the rise of Joao's poetry as a tool for control. But Joao wasn't afraid anymore. With Clara by his side and Ricardo's support, he stood tall. "What you've done to my poetry, to the lives of those it's touched, it ends here," Joao said, his voice firm and commanding. "I refuse to let you use my words to control anyone anymore." There was a moment of silence before chaos erupted. The Collective's leaders tried to run, to destroy the evidence that had been gathered against them, but it was too late. Ricardo had already infiltrated their systems, and everything was being broadcast to the world. Joao's poems, his words, were no longer just instruments of manipulation. They became a call for revolution, a call for truth. The world watched as a conspiracy was revealed. People everywhere saw the faces of those who had sought to use art, culture, and words for their own gain. And in the aftermath, they realized the power of true art, the power of poetry as a means of liberation, not control. Days turned into weeks, and as the dust settled, Clara and Joao found themselves standing on the steps of a new world. A world where words were free again, where creativity and expression weren't chained to a greater agenda. Joao's poetry was no longer hidden in the shadows. It had become a beacon of light, a symbol of resistance, of hope, and through it, people found their voices. As Joao stood in front of a gathering of supporters, ready to speak at his final poetry reading, Clara knew that their journey had come full circle. The evening sky above them was filled with stars, and Joao's voice carried out over the crowd, the words flowing like the river of his soul. In that moment, Clara knew that Joao had found his true purpose. He had not just written poems. He had written history. His poetry had changed the world. And as Joao spoke the final words of his poem, Clara felt a sense of peace. "Sometimes," Joao said, his voice filled with quiet strength, "the words we write are the only thing we can truly control, and in them we find freedom." The crowd erupted in applause, but Clara's thoughts turned inward. She knew the fight wasn't over. But for now, in this moment, they had won. And as the stars shone down on them, Clara realized that this was just the beginning of something much greater. Joao's legacy would live on, beyond the words, beyond the poetry, beyond the fight. It would live in every heart touched by his art.